Good evening. I'm Joe Bankoff. I have the high privilege of serving as the chair of the Sam Nunn School of International Affairs here at Georgia Tech. And on behalf of the Institute and our school and others, I want to welcome you all here tonight to the future of transatlantic relations, a debate. And I can tell you, having had an opportunity to listen to sort of a warm-up session that occurred just before the cocktail reception, you can expect a debate. This is actually to the credit of several of my colleagues, Alistair Young and Adam Stolberg, who are professors in our School of International Affairs, and working with the Brookings Institute and their institution of foreign policy programs and the Charles Koch Institute. There's a series of efforts being made to have thematic debates about America's changing role in the world, and they're being hosted in cities around the country. And the real purpose of this is to foster, frankly, a dialogue that we could talk about things in which there are going to be disagreements, quite understandably, but to have a vigorous but civil and constructive national discussion on the future of American foreign policy. To say that it's timely to do so is a gross understatement. I want to also express my appreciation for all of the people, including my own colleagues, who've worked so hard to put the mechanics of this together. These things do not happen by accident. But I want to then turn this over to one of our newest recruits to our distinguished faculty, General Philip Breedlove. Breedlove is not a name you have not heard before. He's actually been involved in Georgia Tech going back to the 70s when he was a struggling civil engineer. Now, this was before it was civil and environmental engineering, okay? And he steadfastly maintains he built a dam bridge in Gwinnett County and it's still standing, so he was successful. On the other hand, he then went off to flight training and a very distinguished career in the Air Force, which would take forever if I read you everything he had ever done. But he was a fighter pilot, and then he was a commander, and he knows what it is to lead troops. He knows what it is to deal with very contentious situations in which lives are at risk. And then he became the 17th SACEUR, Supreme Commander Allied Forces Europe, in which he deals sort of like a faculty. 28 different countries in the NATO alliance, responding to leadership that is political and then trying to advise and implement from a military point of view. So to say that since he had retired now almost 2 years ago and joined us as a distinguished professor at the Nunn School, we have been greatly enriched by his insights, frankly, his Rolodex, and also his ability to get things started, which is what we're going to call upon him to do tonight. So without further ado, my friend, General Philip Breedlove.
So I had a great way to start this discussion tonight, but then I came in and saw this room. What a magnificent facility. And for a Georgia Tech engineer to come into a room adorned in gold and white, it doesn't get any better than that. So I'm happy to be here. And I'm not going to introduce our panel. You're going to get that in a few minutes. But we have some really brilliant thinkers to talk to us today about some tough subjects. And a couple of these are heroes of mine from the past and fellows who have strived together across some pretty tough situations in the past. So you are going to be blessed, and I think you're going to be really happy with the level of conversation we'll have tonight. Now, the challenge that I was given was to sort of kick this off in 6 minutes, and so I'm going to try to do that very quick. Talk about challenges and opportunities, and I brought sort of two of each to sort of, as we say in the military, roll a grenade out on the table, let it blow up, and see what happens next. So I brought two challenges, if you'll allow me. One is Russia. I will offer that I believe we need to begin a serious dialogue with Russia. I would also offer that, in my humble opinion, we are locked in a partisan political discussion in Washington, D.C., which is not allowing us to move forward with what we need to do. All eyes are focused on what Russia did in this election, and I would offer that Russia did nothing in our election that we haven't done in other countries' elections ourselves in the past. And so we need to get past this current conversation so that we can disassemble the connection to politics and begin what I think is a very important conversation about the larger problem of what Russia is doing in our world. Of course, it's important that we understand what happened in our election and that we fight not to let it happen again in the future. But frankly, we need to get beyond that and get on to dealing with bigger issues. My second challenge is that we need to continue to rebuild Euro-NATO trust in the United States as an ally. We are doing good things in Europe. Our part of the enhanced forward presence, our troops work in the Baltic nations, in Poland and Romania and other places, are very important work, and they demonstrate our commitment. But our relationship and the trust factor between our European partners and us have been shaken. And we need to get past that. Words are important, but actions are far more important. And so one of our challenges is to continue to rebuild our position of leadership and Europe's position of trust towards us as an ally. Okay, some opportunities that I would like to throw on the table, and these are maybe loosely defined as opportunities. The first is that whether you agree with why it happened or not, whether you agree with the rhetoric that caused much of the actions, what we see in NATO now in our transatlantic relationship is a renewed understanding that our NATO partners need to be a bigger part of their own defense. And we see multiple nations now that are moving forward in their investments in their militaries, meeting the responsibilities that they laid out for themselves of investing 2% of their GDP. And we see nations now moving towards that. That is a momentum thing. I would argue that we need to increase the momentum of our European allies in assuming their responsibilities for their own defenses. Reward and highlight those who are on the right path, and ensure that they're making the right kind of investments. Encourage them along that line. A lot of people talk about the 2% as the number. I think as important is that what they agreed to was that they would invest 2% of their GDP, and 20% of that 2% would be spent on recapitalization and modernization of their forces. And since all our nations, to include ours, took a huge peace dividend when the wall fell, all of our nations find themselves in the same dilemma that we do here in America, that our readiness is not what it needs to be, and that we need to invest smartly. Secondly, and probably more controversially as an opportunity, I would say we need to retool some of the processes that we use in Europe to bring policy decisions and policy implementation in the international fora. The one that I pick on all the time is Normandy. I don't believe that the agreements in Minsk and the Normandy format that we talk about is working for the problem in Ukraine. I do not believe that these are profiting or moving forward, bringing peace to the eastern part of Ukraine. And I would offer purely a personal opinion. I believe that's because American leadership is absent in the Normandy process. And so I would offer that we need to take the opportunity to become more involved in some of these policy processes which are, in my opinion, not working in Europe. So we had a lively debate in the first hour, and I've rolled a few grenades out on the table. The good news is that the dummy will now sit down and the experts will now take the stage. And we'll have some wonderful conversation. I look forward to it. Thank you all for being here. Thank you all, those who put their hard work into making this happen. Go Jackets.
Thank you, General Philip. You all hear me? Is this mic working?
This is what the general meant by recapitalization.
This is the grenade, actually.
There we go.
Do it Lincoln Douglas style. Okay. Okay. Sorry about that, folks. Thank you, General Breedlove. Good evening and welcome to the third debate on America's changing role in the world, convened by the Brookings Institution and Charles Koch Institute in partnership with Politico. I'm Michael Crowley, National Security Editor for Politico, and it is a pleasure to be here in Atlanta with our host, the Sam Nunn School of International Affairs at the Georgia Institute of Technology. Thank you to Joseph Bankoff and General Breedlove for kicking off tonight's event, and thank you to our audience here in the room and those joining us online. And extra personal thank you and hello to Senator Sam Nunn, who has taught me a lot over the years about security issues, particularly nuclear security. It was a pleasure to see you here tonight, Senator. This debate continues a series of thematic debates visiting cities around the United States to foster a vigorous, civil, and constructive national discussion on the future of American foreign policy. Tonight's debate will focus on the future of relations between the United States and Europe. It will proceed in 4 segments. 1 is a first round of debate moderated by me. 2 is a question and answer session comprised of selected questions from our in-person audience and followers on Twitter. 3 is a second round of debate, and 4 is brief closing statements. To keep the conversation moving, our debaters have been asked to limit their answers to 90 seconds. Our audience in the room and online are encouraged to submit questions on Twitter using the hashtag #AmericaInTheWorld, #AmericaInTheWorld. Those in the room can submit questions in writing on note cards collected by debate organizers at about the 15-minute mark during our first segment of debate. With that, let me introduce our debaters from left to right for those in the audience. Tom Wright is the director of the Center on the United States and Europe and a senior fellow in the Project on International Order and Strategy at Brookings. Wright's work focuses on U.S. grand strategy, Donald Trump's worldview, and the future of Europe.
It's a moving target.
He's a busy man. His book, All Measures Short of War, The Contest for the 21st Century and the Future of American Power, was released in May 2017 and examines the return of geopolitical rivalries in an interconnected world. Barry Posen is the Ford International Professor of Political Science and Director of the Security Studies Program at MIT. His research interests include international security, military strategy, nuclear studies, and military doctrine. He has written 3 books, the most recent of which, Restraint, A New Foundation for U.S. Grand Strategy, was heralded as, quote, compulsory reading for anyone concerned with both the direction that U.S. grand strategy has followed, as compulsory reading for anyone concerned with the direction that U.S. grand strategy has followed since the end of the Cold War. Victoria Nuland is Chief Executive Officer at the Center for a New American Security. A U.S. diplomat for 32 years, she led American diplomacy toward Europe as Assistant Secretary of State for European and Eurasian Affairs from September 2013 until January 2017. Previously, she served, among other posts, as State Department spokesperson under Hillary Clinton and U.S. Ambassador to NATO during President George W. Bush's second term. And Joshua Schifrinson is an assistant professor in the Bush School of Government and Public Service at Texas A&M University. There he teaches courses on U.S. foreign relations and international security. His research interests include U.S. foreign policy, grand strategy, international relations theory, and diplomatic history, where his research on the end of the Cold War has particularly expanded the historical and policy debate. His forthcoming book is Rising Titans, Falling Giants, Rising States and the Fate of Declining Great Powers. So with those introductions, let's dive right in. This is going to be a great conversation with some of the smartest people on this subject. And I'm going to dispense with the formalities, and instead of Dr. Posen, Ambassador Newland, and so forth, I hope you won't mind if I will address you by your first names. And Barry, I'd like to begin with you. You are the provocateur, the chief provocateur on the stage, I might argue, and maybe you can set the groundwork here, be the second grenade of the evening, perhaps. You've written on the challenges facing a United States stretched across the globe, and of the need for a more restrained foreign policy. Can you describe for us what such a policy would mean for America's role in Europe? And why is the transatlantic relationship not serving American interests sufficiently that a change is warranted in that relationship?
Multi-part question. First of all, thanks to the organizers and thanks to the co-panelists for being here. Should I wait till you get that mic sorted out, or should I just, okay. So international politics is basically a tough neighborhood. Any state can use force against any other state. As a consequence, when you decide to take up projects in international politics, you're always running some kind of risk, right? Now, in that environment where war is always possible, the first duty of any state is to look to its security. And for me, security is about sovereignty, safety, territorial integrity, and power position. These are the things that the United States needs to defend, needs to look after. Now remember, power position is a means to an end, and we're not talking about power after power for its own sake. We're talking about sufficient power to do the kinds of things that we need to do. Now, the United States does have interests, and we can talk about what those interests might be, right? But we should always remember the United States is a very, very safe country compared to most other countries in international politics. Got oceans to the right and left, weak and pliant neighbors to the north and south, nuclear deterrent, big economy, good military. I mean, it's a pretty good situation. So if people want you, if anyone wants you to do something abroad, they should have the high hill to climb, right? It's not me who should have the high hill to climb, it's they should have the high hill to climb, right? Now, when I look at Europe, my question is not, did Europe ever matter to the United States? Was it ever a security issue for the United States? My question is, in the post-Cold War world, given all the various projects that we have at home and abroad, right, is it possible that the Europeans could look after themselves, right? And that's the point I've been trying to make about transatlantic relations. The Europeans are rich enough, well-armed enough, technologically advanced enough, sufficiently capable vis-a-vis their most plausible challenger, the Russians, to look after themselves. And America, that needs to find ways to consolidate resources for other things, should probably begin to think about how to change the transatlantic relationship.
Great, thank you for that. Toria, maybe it'll turn to you for the first response. And what do you make of that? Do you think that Europe can get by without the United States?
I think Barry just effectively described the position that the United States effectively took in the 1920s and in the 1930s, which was after the horrors of World War I, after being dragged across the pond, we decided that Europe could heal itself, that it could manage its own problems. We hid behind our walls, and we all know where that led: global recession, the rise of Hitler. And why did we make a different choice after World War II? Because we decided that a small investment in partnership, in economic stimulus for Europe, in shared security, and I take issue with Barry's point that Europe should take care of its security itself and we should take care of our security. We take care of each other's security together in the current environment. That those small investments would increase the family of countries that lived in security, in stability, in prosperity, and that we, in fact, could then have an influence on how the planet was organized. I would argue that today, although the president is right that Europeans can make a larger contribution to their security, as is General Breedlove, that they are not making no contribution to their security and that they, in fact, make a contribution to our security. I stood at NATO headquarters as the deputy when NATO invoked Article 5, an attack on one is an attack on all, for the first time in its history, not to protect Europe, but to protect us after September 11th. I also worked with 28 countries, 26 of them in NATO at that time, and the rest outside, to take on the Taliban in Afghanistan. So this is, I worry that what Barry is positing is exactly what the president said we're not going to do, America alone, rather than America in partnership with other countries that share our interests and our values to lighten the burden on us, not to increase it.
Josh, what about it? America alone, America in partnership, where do you come down on that? In your writings on the end of the Cold War, you've detailed the way the United States became involved in European security to prevent the Soviet Union from dominating Europe and perhaps tipping the balance of power against the United States. Is it essential to remain involved to prevent that from happening again?
Well, so first of all, let me just echo Barron, thanking all of you for having me out here and thanking Georgia Tech for putting on this really wonderful event. To answer the question, Toria is 100% correct that U.S. isolationism, which is not the same thing as restraint, which we should speak about, caused problems in the interwar period. But the world is not of the interwar period. There is no nascent European hegemon. There's no Nazi Germany out there. Russia is a shadow of what the Soviet Union was. Its GDP, the Russian GDP, is smaller than Italy's. If this was a world where there was a geopolitical threat to the continent of Europe and a nascent hegemon in the offing, we'd be having a different conversation. This is not the world of today. Indeed, I did a little bit of math before this session. The East European countries alone have a GDP on par with Russia, bracketing the rest of NATO. The Europeans are rich and secure enough to take care of themselves in the absence of a threat that even approximates Nazi Germany or Stalin's Soviet Union. And before I get too far off field, it's worth remembering that the initial European impetus, which Toria spoke to very nicely, was a call for very brief engagement on the part of internationalists such as Truman, Eisenhower, and George Kennan, whereupon the U.S. would then get out of Europe. We're asking for that mission to be fulfilled and for the U.S. to come on home, or at least take a more restrained position.
Tom, what do you say? I mean, it's not the Europe of 1945. It's a very different world from the one that cemented our current relationship. Why can't it change? And maybe, remind us of first principles. I mean, so why is it important that we have this transatlantic bond, and why do you think that we shouldn't be reconsidering it?
Thank you, Michael, and thank you to Georgia Tech and to Senator Nunn and General Breedlove and to all of you here for having us. I mean, I guess my answer to that question would be that the strategy has been a tremendous success. It's been really an incredible success. If you look at what the United States has accomplished in Europe over the last 70 years, US support was vital to creating the European Union and to European integration. Germany became a democratic economic powerhouse. After the Cold War, we may, I'm sure, differ up here on NATO expansion, but Eastern Europe became economically prosperous and democratic. Some of that is endangered now and needs to be protected. All of those things created a continent that was economically strong, a partner of the United States on trade, but also on security issues, as Toria talked about. And the question is, what was the cost of that? I mean, I would be curious to know from our colleagues who are critical, what actually is the cost of the US being in Europe each year. It's actually cheaper to have the troops that are there than it is to bring them home because of support for forward basing from allied countries. And Josh and Barry have written elsewhere about what they would like to see in Europe, which includes winding up NATO, reducing the military commitment. Is a policy as radical as ending NATO really the appropriate answer to a strategy that seems to have provided extraordinary success for the United States and for American security?
Barry, tell us a little bit more about how you would change the nature of the relationship. I mean, what does your theory of restraint look like in a little more detail when it comes to the relationship with Europe?
Well, my view about American grand strategy is it produces certain kinds of pernicious consequences. And one of those pernicious consequences occurs in Europe. If people want to ask the question, why do the Europeans, at least relative to what NATO says it wants, seem to spend so little, then you have to ask the question of why do we spend so much, right? Those things are related. You know, we had a discussion in this country a few years ago about moral hazards and the problem of excessive insurance causing risky behavior. The Europeans today are spending under 1.5% of GDP on defense. Now, that's not a good metric, but it's the metric that NATO uses for public discussion. The United States is spending 3.3% of GDP on defense, right? If Europeans feel insecure, they are certainly capable of spending more. They're collectively much richer than the Russians. In fact, France and Germany alone are much richer than the Russians. They're equally populous, right? They actually spend more on defense somehow, right? So the point here is that you know, when we look across the world and ask about the different things the United States could be committing itself to and could be allocating resources for, this seems like an odd one. This seems like the case where, in a weird way, I'm agreeing with, you know, my partners here. I mean, our policy was crashingly successful. We produced a Europe that can stand on its own 2 feet. We helped produce the collapse of the Soviet Union, which was the only threat that was left in that place, right? At this point, it really ought to be able to operate more or less without a lot of American assistance, right? And so, you know, when we look at our own defense budget, what we're hearing is that, you know, we have too little for this and too little for that. We have big debates in this country about defense relative to other things. So we should be pinching pennies. And one place we could pinch some pennies, it seems to me, is Western Europe.
Toria, what do you make of that? And also wonder if you'd elaborate quickly on the idea that Europe contributes to our security. If you could talk more about that, because that's a fundamental part of your argument, I think.
You know, I think this completely misunderstands both the U.S. defense budget and why we're prepositioned in Europe. First of all, yes, the U.S. spends 3.3% on defense, but the vast majority of that does not go to defending Europe. It goes to our work in the Middle East, it goes to keeping sea lanes open in Asia, all of those kinds of things. What we have in Europe now, because of the foundation we've built, because they're rich enough to help economically, politically, in security terms, is we have a family of nations that also helps us maintain a stable, open, prosperous, increasingly democratic world out there together. We deploy together in Africa. Even when we went to Iraq, we had 20 European countries with us. People forget that. In every single deployment that we have, Europe comes with us because the NATO platform allows us to train together, to work together, to decide together how to attack common enemies, from terrorism to a resurgent Russia to now getting Europe more involved in Asia. And those bases that we have are tiny lily pads compared to what they used to be, and they also allow us to jump off. How do we fly in Syria? We fly partly from Europe and from Turkey. How do we manage Africa from bases in Europe? And we do a lot of that together, and our systems are joint, and we can talk to each other. So I don't know why you would want to give that up. The investment is tiny for the return, both in terms of Europe feeling confident to join us, but also in terms of global stability.
Josh, isn't that a good argument? It's not 1945 anymore. Europe's not in a state of crisis. That's debatable, actually. We can come back to that point. Maybe it is. But isn't there a new status quo where we're accruing all kinds of benefits, and we should continue to reap them in the way that Toria just explained?
Well, I think it's 100% true that the U.S. flies hither, thither, and yon from bases in Europe, and it has pre-positioned equipment all across the continent. And that does provide benefits to the United States if it's going to engage in a host of cockamamie schemes throughout those faraway regions. I think the debate we're having on the stage is that these are not real vital interests of the United States, point number one. Point number two, the United States, if it needs to get involved in those regions and fundamentally decides it's actually in the United States' interest to do so, it doesn't require a permanent commitment to Europe to do so. And to the point of what are the costs, which I think Tom raised and Victoria pivoted to discuss the benefits accrued, we're forgetting the most fundamental one, which is that NATO is a promise for the U.S. at the ultimate end of the day to go to nuclear war for these countries. And if we're going to talk about a European crisis, we have to be aware of the possibility that we may end up going to a nuclear war with Russia if deterrence fails for the sake of the Baltic states, Poland, and other countries. And maybe it's just me. I'm just a middle-class kid from New Jersey, so I don't really know a lot. But I don't want to trade Raleigh for Riga.
Well, what was it that Newt Gingrich said we wouldn't trade? Was that the Newt Gingrich line?
No, I have no idea where that came from. I just made it up.
I thought you were quoting from a.
No, I'm half historian. I don't read recent stuff.
Right. Okay. Fair enough. Well, anyway.
Can I just say,
go ahead, please.
it's a really cute line, and I congratulate you for finding a city in Georgia to use this time. But if the Russians, no, North Carolina, I guess, right? Wherever we are. But if the Russians have nuked Riga, we have a much bigger global planetary problem, and I would hope we would at least be prepositioned in Europe to deal with it.
Okay. Well, we've opened the subject of Russia, which is something that everyone can agree on, fortunately. So this should be the easiest portion of the evening. Josh, why don't I throw it back to you, actually? Why don't you frame the question, since we're talking about global nuclear war and trading cities?
I'd rather not trade cities.
What about the idea?
Let's not. And I'm getting them in the wrong state anyway. Yeah.
Is Russia a threat to Europe? Is Russia an actual threat to Europe? And I guess that can be divided into military and political questions. Answer it however you want, because we'll kick it around for a little while. Let's start with that opening question.
Is Russia a military threat to Europe? You know, I'm going to do the classic academic thing and reframe the question. Where in Europe is the question? Is Russia a potential threat to the Baltic states and the countries near its borders? Yeah, Russia is a threat to those countries, absolutely. I don't think any of us on the stage would really deny that possibility. Is Russia a threat to Western Europe? To a lesser degree, especially in political sense. Is Russia a threat to the United States in an active sense, bracketing its legacy of nuclear weapons, which require a cooperative approach to reduce? I would argue not, and I suspect my co-panelists disagree with me on this, and it's a good debate to be had. But that only takes us back to the original question. If you buy my premise that Russia is a threat to parts of Eastern Europe, lesser Western Europe, and not so much the United States, and that increases the United States' disincentive to rely first and foremost upon the Europeans to take care of their own security. Unless we think the Europeans are feckless and irresolute allies, these are countries that fought themselves to the brink of disaster in 2 world wars. And if they face threats by Russia, as Tom well knows from his own really great research on this, they tend to ally with each other. So my simple point is, if they want to do this, and the threat is there, why not avert even a minuscule risk of nuclear war? Why take that on if you're the United States?
Tom, how does Vladimir Putin's foreign policy shape the way you think about the U.S.-European relationship, and in particular NATO?
Thanks. I just want to comment on one thing Josh said
Sure.
first and then come to your question and what Barry said, because it strikes me as a bit peculiar that both of you say U.S. policy in Europe has succeeded and that it's actually in great shape and therefore the U.S. should get out. There isn't a sports team alive, if it was winning, that would stop training. I mean, you know, you don't really give up the recipe of success. If things are actually going well, then why change a winning formula? Why do something as radical as abolishing NATO? And I think the key is in terms of how you define U.S. interests, which I think is a big difference between us, because I would be curious how bad things would need to get in Europe for you to think that the US had an interest in it. Because my reading of your work is that it would need to be a threat of Russian hegemony, that Russia would actually need to be about to be invading Paris for there to be a reason to be engaged. But since the Cold War, since World War II, US strategy globally, but particularly in Europe and Asia, has been stability and building a peaceful, liberal regional order.
That wasn't our strategy.
Building a peaceful...
That wasn't our strategy. Our strategy was about containment. It was a balance of power strategy. That was our strategy. You're rewriting history. We went there for one reason, right? It was to be sure that a hegemon did not conquer all of industrial Eurasia and organize it as a military force against us. We went to balance Russian power, and we succeeded.
I disagree with that, because I think there was a twofold strategy. I mean, you could contain Russian power by promoting dictatorship in Germany as a counterweight to Russian power, right? The United States chose to contain Russian power by building a liberal democratic regional order in Europe and one in Asia. So it's an inextricable part of the strategy. But the question remains, which is, you know, my view, and I suspect Toria's view too, is that the United States has an interest in a strong and prosperous and peaceful Europe that's a partner of the United States. I'm still waiting for the answer about what US interests are in Europe that would merit engagement from a restraint perspective.
Okay, Barry, why don't you take that? We'll go to Toria for my original question
Sorry.
to you. But Barry, no, that's fine. This is great. Go ahead, Barry.
Well, I think you're asking, how do I conceive of threats to the United States, right? And as I said at the outset, I think the United States is inherently a pretty secure country, so it takes really big problems in the world to be threats to the United States. So the things that concern me are threats of hegemony in Asia, or threats of hegemony in Europe, or nuclear attacks on the United States, or potentially nuclear terrorism. Right? These are the things that I think are threats to sovereignty, safety, territorial integrity, power position. Right? And my point is that there is very little risk of Russian hegemony in Europe. Doesn't mean that Russia isn't a threat. Threat is based on some mix of capabilities and intent. Putin clearly is an ambitious guy. Russia has turned itself into a tough little military power. But it is not a great rich state. It's not a candidate for hegemony in Europe. And pretty much, almost any two of the four principal powers in Europe could easily balance Russia. So I'm having a problem seeing what the big security problem is for the United States and Europe. And by the way, we can play arithmetical games counting resources and what it costs. If you believe every person in the United States establishment who talks about American regional military commitments, everyone for every region will tell you we spend nothing to defend any of those regions. We spend nothing in Asia, we spend nothing here in Europe, we spend nothing in the Middle East. Somehow we spend nothing everywhere. It's just incredibly cheap. But somehow when you add up all that we do, it's not so cheap. $600–700 billion a year, not so cheap, right? So this project costs us something. Right? Now, we can argue about what those numbers are, but it costs us something. And as Josh says, it incurs risks.
Okay, let me cut you off. Thank you so much. Toria, let me actually reframe the question a little bit and rewind.
Can I just go to cost?
Yes.
It costs nothing. Think about your family budget, 3.3% of our total GDP on all this security all over the world. 1%, less than 1% on diplomacy and development all over the world. It is an incredible bargain. And why is it a bargain? It's a bargain because we have allies and partners who share the burden with us, in part because we make these security and trade deals with
You
them.
left out the 1% of GDP we're now spending on the Veterans Administration in order to support the people that we've sent to the past wars that we've fought.
Let me stay with Toria for a second. Talk about Vladimir Putin's role in that cost now. To what degree should he be shaping the way we think about this conversation?
Barry said that hegemony and hegemonists worry him. That is one thing that he thinks is a risk to U.S. interests. Vladimir Putin is a dissatisfied leader territorially. He has twice invaded his neighbors in the last 10 years, first Georgia and then Ukraine. If we had not stood with our European partners and imposed biting sanctions, he would have rolled to Kyiv and then potentially on to Poland and who knows where else. And this is partly because he is not succeeding at home at creating a prosperous, open society that can be self-sustaining. So he needs these foreign adventures. So I would argue that we do need to stand with Europe in slowing the roll. We had a bargain that we thought we made with Russia when the Cold War ended, which was that all nations would stay within their borders, all nations would govern themselves how they chose, that the global economic pie would be available for everybody to compete for. But once you start eating into your neighbor's security, once you start choosing security for them, where does it end? And who gets to decide this country can be free and that one can't? It'll come all the way to our shores if we don't stand up to it.
Josh, President Donald Trump has been a little equivocal about his commitment to Article 5 of the NATO treaty, which is the collective self-defense provision. We were chatting beforehand, and you mentioned that Trump didn't mention NATO in the State of the Union address last night. But do you basically think that kind of equivocation is appropriate? I mean, he's sending a signal that he basically doesn't think it's a great idea. He seems to have grudgingly come around and uttered the language that the sort of establishment advisors around him want. But do you think it's appropriate for the United States to be backing away to that security commitment in general? Do you think that it's time to start winding down NATO's posture in Europe?
Well, so let me go to something that was raised before, and then I'll pivot to address your question. First of all, I actually rather disagree with the point that was just made as to what the Putin's revisionism means, what the bargain that was struck at the end of the Cold War entailed, and this is chum in the water for me because I've actually read the archival document on this. The deal that was struck at the end of the Cold War between Secretary of State James Baker and the then leadership of the Soviet Union, which Russia took over the treaty obligations, the security obligations of the Soviet Union, was that NATO would not expand eastward. And so, well, this is not to apologize or even condone Putin's behavior in any way, shape, or form. But if we are to go into what the source of revisionism or the first impetus for revisionism came from, it came from when the United States began expanding NATO eastward for reasons that it chose to do. So if we're going to talk about where the territorial revisionism comes from, where the impetus to change Europe's security architecture comes from, we should begin first and foremost with the decision to expand NATO in the mid-1990s, point number one. Now to answer your question about Article 5. Article 5 is a funny little device, and if you read the archives as to how we got Article 5, we actually see U.S. policymakers struggling mightily to give ourselves escape clauses going, well, we'll do provide all the security assistance deemed necessary to provide for the collective defense. Deemed necessary is a funny phrase, because you can deem nothing necessary. In the moment you can say, well, why not do anything? Why do anything? So what is Donald Trump doing? I think he's scaring the Europeans a little bit. I rightly, wrongly, or indifferently, he's scaring the Europeans by reminding them that Article 5, which for the last 25 years we've pretended was a sacrosanct pledge, is in fact a wishy-washy commitment. And if I was the Europeans, I'd be reading this and going, this is a bad situation because the thing I was told was sacrosanct, turns out I signed a deal that isn't actually sacrosanct. So I think he's putting the Europeans on notice, and the American body politic is putting the Europeans on notice, rightly, wrongly, or indifferently.
Toria, I'm going to give you the last word in this segment. I'm going to let you choose. Do you want to address this question of NATO expansion? You served under Strobe Talbot, who was Deputy Secretary of State under Bill Clinton, was instrumental in NATO expansion, and you also were an ambassador to NATO. But I suspect you also have very strong feelings about the Article 5 question. You can respond to either or both, but 90 seconds, and we'll move on to the next segment.
Well, I have to first start with Josh's facts with regard to what we promised the Russians and what we didn't. Both Jim Baker and George Bush, who negotiated the reunification of Germany, say publicly that they never made such a pledge to the Russians. Now, I have no doubt that the Russians or the Soviets at that time believed that that pledge was made, and certainly they believed there was a pledge not to put NATO forces in the eastern part of Germany. But the main thing I want to say about NATO enlargement is that the critics of it paint it as the U.S. and its allies going out and singing this siren song of wooing to these countries. Nothing could be further from the truth. All of those countries of Central and Eastern Europe were begging to be part of NATO, went through incredible years of rigorous political, economic, and security reform, judicial reform that we demanded of them, and that some of them are now backsliding on, in order to become members of NATO and members of the EU, to look like us. And they did that because they had come to grief twice by living in a security gray zone, and they wanted to be cemented in with us. We drove a very hard bargain before we accepted them into NATO. But imagine what would have happened if we had said, Poland, we don't like you. We're not so sure. Good luck to you out there. Imagine what would have happened if we'd said to, half of Germany, you guys can reunify, but we really, don't think that we need to protect the other half. We would have simply opened a door for far more mischief, and we would have had far more conflict in Europe if we had not done that. Now, we're driving a harder bargain at the moment.
Okay, sorry to interrupt you. Thank you.
Please.
And maybe we can come back to Article 5 in a bit. But we're now going to switch to our questions submitted by our audience and on Twitter. So let me throw the first one to you, Tom, if I may. And the question is, can Germany replace the U.S. leadership role in NATO? Is Angela Merkel now the leader of the free world?
Unfortunately not, is the short answer. Merkel has been a terrific chancellor on security issues, in particular, maybe a little more controversial on Eurozone issues, but she's coming near the end of her tenure. I mean, there's complicated negotiations going at the moment for coalition arrangements in Berlin. She may stay chancellor for a while, but it would only be for a relatively short while. And Germany, as a country, is playing a constructive role in European security, but it will never be able to fulfill the role that the United States has played. It will never be able to provide that security guarantee to other NATO members and to have that believed by Putin. So I think we want Germany to play a greater role, but it won't be a replacement for the United States. And the United States doesn't need a replacement because actually the role that the US is playing is very sustainable. You may say, Josh, that there's Article 5 is empty, but it's worked since the creation of NATO.
I didn't say it's
so
empty.
it's been failing spectacularly well, in terms of providing what it intended. So I think that it works because it raises doubts in Russia's mind about an invasion, and I think we can stick to it fairly straightforwardly.
Barry, maybe I would have you jump in. Is this music to your ears? The Germany playing a new leadership role in NATO, Angela Merkel assuming some of this leadership burden that the United States has been shouldering for many years, decades?
Well, I think we have to be a little bit conscious of European political history when we talk about future relationships. I think picking one country, and particularly Germany, to somehow substitute for the United States, or to expect it to substitute for the United States, is probably putting a little too much burden on that one country. And it's particularly problematical for Germany because of its history. So the Germans have to walk carefully. So my own view is that the bilateral Franco-German relationship is probably now the most important relationship in Europe. And with France basically being the more martial of the two powers, and Germany being the more economically viable of the two powers, the more economically capable of the two powers. And I think now, I'm guessing that now that Britain is out of the European Union, you're going to see a rather different European Union. So when we talk about, what's going to substitute for the United States, it's not one country, it's a coalition of the most capable states in the European Union that's going to be the arbiters of Western European security.
So we have two questions that are directed toward Ambassador Nunn. I'm actually going to split one off and give it to you, Josh, and you, Toria, I'm sure can jump in on it. And it's really just an open-ended question about the Trump administration's policy toward Ukraine, which of course is fundamental to this conversation. So how would you evaluate that policy, particularly based on expectations, I think, concerns probably among people like Toria going into the Trump administration that the United States position was going to shift substantially, and really hasn't, although I'll let Toria speak for herself. I know some people were concerned about that. How would you evaluate the way Trump has approached Ukraine, and what implications does that have for the U.S.-European, U.S.-Russia relationship?
It's a very interesting question. I'll admit I haven't followed Trump and Ukraine probably as judiciously as I should have, or as carefully as I should have. So everything I'm about to say should be taken with a massive grain of salt, or perhaps some borscht, as the case might be. Nevertheless, it seems that the consensus has formed in American foreign policy across the Obama and Trump administrations that it's not worth tangling more with Russia over Ukraine than already occurred in 14-15, right? There was a process of deliberation where the U.S. seemed to wonder what the stakes of the game were in Ukraine. Certainly the U.S. doesn't like the seizure of Crimea, nor should it like the seizure of Crimea by the Russian government. Nevertheless, it seems that we seem as a country to come to consensus that the risk of tangling even more with Russia over the future of Ukraine is probably not worth it. And to the extent that there is a change in the Trump administration, it would be an evolutionary change where we still see hints every so often that Ukrainian accession to NATO at some point in the future might be on the table. I think this is a disastrous idea for any number of different reasons. The Trump administration, like the Obama administration, hasn't quite said this issue is off the table in perpetuity, so I think that causes the Russians to continue anting up. Nevertheless, I see the Trump administration's policy as an evolutionary one.
Give us 20 seconds on why that's a disastrous idea.
Sure.
Ukraine in NATO.
Well, I've already mentioned that the U.S. is risking, at the end of the day, a nuclear war for the sake of Riga, and I'm not going to repeat my witty line because it's not going to work twice. But if you imagine a country that's going to antagonize the Russians even more, it would be Ukraine. At least the Baltic states had a history of being independent states before their conquest by the Soviet Union. Ukraine, however, was always, well, not always, but since in modern European times, part of the Russian imperial state. then subsequent to the Soviet Union. So if you were to imagine taking on a piece of territory that is historically and also ethnically, given the number of ethnic Russians in the Ukraine, liable to cause a super-rating soar in U.S.-Russia relations for the foreseeable future, I could not pick a better target.
Tori, I know this is a subject very near and dear to you. I don't think we ever spoke, but I was with Secretary of State John Kerry when he visited Kiev shortly after the Maidan Revolution, saw you laying flowers at the site where demonstrators had been gunned down. Surely you must be pleasantly surprised by the Trump administration's approach to Ukraine. At least if you shared the fears that many people who have a similar worldview to yours had in 2016 around the time of Trump's inauguration, that Trump was going to cut a deal with Vladimir Putin and the U.S. was going to sort of surrender its position on Ukraine. But how would you assess his policy over the past year there?
I think we're all gratified that the cost in terms of sanctions that the U.S. and Europe and its Asian allies put on Russia for its invasion of Ukraine has been maintained, and that we have not given up our position, particularly in the context of needing to negotiate a way for the Russians to get out of Ukraine, not giving it up for nothing. But I would argue that it's a status quo policy right now. We have neither put forward, either with Germany and France, and I agree with Barry that they need to be the engine of European security, but with us, not instead of us. We have not put forward new initiatives to spur a peace deal in the Donbass, which I think is possible, nor have we used the sanctions lever either as a carrot or a stick, offering to lower sanctions if the Russians get out or increase them if they continue to stall. So I would hope that after Putin's been through his election, that we and our in March,
Yep.
that we and our allies in Europe will, and the Ukrainians will come forward with some initiatives and increase the cost on Putin if he continues to stall, but also begin to normalize if in fact he gets out of Ukraine.
Barry, another one of our audience questions I'll present to you. How do the World Bank, the IMF, the EU, the post-World War II institutions play into this calculus, into your theory? Are they outdated? Do we need to revisit those institutions as well?
Well, I don't claim to be an international political economist, and I don't want to get beyond my brief. But the European Union is not our creature. We're not in the European Union. The European Union is a European creature, right? And it's as much a political project as it is an economic one. In fact, it began really as an arms control agreement to basically, denationalize the coal and steel industries of Europe so that they couldn't be mobilized again for war, right? So it's a distinctly European project. Now, it was nursemaided to maturity under the security umbrella of NATO, right? And my expectation, should the United States choose to diminish its role in NATO or end its role in NATO, is that the principal security institution in Europe will be the European Union in some form, right? And my own view, given the theories that inform my understanding of international politics, is that getting the United States out of Europe is going to make the European Union more cohesive, not less cohesive. As one of the founding fathers said, we better hang together, we'll surely hang apart. Europe is trying to make it in a world full of giants now, and those giants are in the Pacific, like China, giants like the United States, coming giants like India. If they want to, have something to say about how the world is governed, they have to make this project work, right? So I support the European Union, and I actually think it'll be better for them if the NATO relationship is ended.
Tom, we can talk a little more about the EU in a minute, but focus on the larger global architecture here, the sort of post-World War II system that the United States helped to construct. Do you think that it's truly at risk, and is the Trump administration endangering it? How much time do you spend worrying about that much larger issue that goes beyond transatlantic?
Probably
relations, but
more than
involves
is healthy. Look, I think there's a couple of things going on. I think we can set Trump's policy of unilateralism to one side just for the moment. The way I think about it is the United States built these institutions with Europe and with Japan after World War II, and they were Western in the sense that they were populated by democratic market economies. And after the Cold War, those institutions basically went global and included all countries, including China, and in most cases, although not all cases, Russia. And that worked fairly well for a while, but the big story of the last 5 years is this return of geopolitical competition between the United States and Europe and Japan on the one hand, and China and Russia in different ways on the other. And I do think that makes those institutions much more problematic. Maybe not necessarily all of the ones you outlined. I think the IMF works fairly well and the World Bank works fairly well. But the G20 and the larger sort of array of architecture is rendered somewhat problematic. And there is really a contest to shape this international order. And we see it with Russia's interference in the elections and all sorts of things. We see it with China's activities in Asia, but it's between two different models, an order that is essentially open and democratic and is organized around American alliances on the one hand, and an order that is more nationalistic, more mercantilist, and really based around spheres of influences in Europe and Asia on the other. And that, I think, is really the big question in terms of where the architecture and the overall order is headed.
Let me do the last audience question before we turn to General Breedlove for the truly final one from this segment. And Tori, I'll put this to you, which is how can the United States work with nations like Estonia, as the questioner says, as an example of technologically sophisticated post-Soviet bloc states to counter Russian active measures in Europe. So I guess the question is, what is the role for working with European partners, particularly in Eastern Europe, to counter this Russian political subversion that's underway?
Well, for those of us who had watched Russian efforts to manipulate voting first at home, then to manipulate the political discourse in Ukraine and to the cyber attacks on Eastern Europe, we would have done better if we had learned those lessons and absorbed them and reacted to them in the United States well before our own election, because a lot of the techniques and tactics that we saw used on us were just the 2.0 or 3.0 version of what had been tried and used in other countries. So there is a huge amount to learn. Unfortunately, Russia was successfully able to use its smaller neighbors as a test bed for a lot of these techniques. But now they are all learning from what happened in the United States, and it's a matter of collective deterrence. It's a matter of unmasking and exposing in real time, as the French were able to do in their election, is one of the best disinfectants, sunshine. But it's also about criminalizing activity, regulatory regime, et cetera. And in the United States, it's going to take a whole of government plus industry plus the population effort to harden ourselves. Barry made a point earlier that we left ourselves open, and we did. But now we need to get it together, and we should learn from the little guys, but also work with them.
Josh, you want to top that off really quickly before I turn to General Breedlove? Do you think it's appropriate for the U.S. to be working with Eastern European countries in that context to try to counter Russian active measures, or is that just somewhere we don't need to be poking around, in your view?
To the extent that the U.S. can work with the East Europeans on mitigating Russian influence and mitigating the tools that can undercut the U.S. political system at home, I agree with that. I would just simply note that doesn't require NATO. Hard stop.
Okay, great. The perfect opportunity to turn now to General Breedlove for our final audience question. Thank you.
So, fascinating discussion. My measure of success is that my blood pressure has gone from normal to 280 over 175, which tells me that we've had a great debate on both sides of the issue, and I think well-said opinions, wherever you fall, they're well-said opinions. So what I threw out the question, I came prepared based on the conversation. I have a different one to pose to you, and it's really will allow you maybe to make your sort of culminating argument. So the first SACEUR was Dwight D. Eisenhower. I had the privilege of sitting at his desk. Every SACEUR is sat at that desk. It's really ergonomically horrible, but there's something important about sitting at that desk. But every SACEUR since that time has been an American general. And that is because the Europeans have looked to American leadership through these years. So my question is bifurcated. To those of you that agree with me, and my supposition is NATO is important and American leadership is important of NATO. And so if you were to agree with me, what does American leadership look like into the future? We've also heard a voice that NATO may not be so important. So if NATO is not so important, and whether you suppose that it should go away or diminish, what does American leadership look like when it comes to European defense under those conditions?
Can I be heretical here and say that in Europe, in Allied Europe, as compared to the wilds of the Balkans and the East, it's not about leadership, it's about partnership. It's about partnership for burden sharing. It's about partnership for keeping Allied territory safe, whether it's on their side of the Atlantic or on our side of the Atlantic. It's about partnership for defending the liberal world order, keeping markets open, values strong, tolerance, openness, all those things that have given us 70 years of prosperity and no great power war. But in the rest of the world, it's about being absolutely strong, and there's a reason why the political leader of NATO is a European and the military leader of NATO is an American. It's about that partnership to take care of ourselves, but also to project for a more stable and peaceful and prosperous world.
Barry, do you want to jump in?
Well, my understanding, for the reason why there has always had to be a U.S. SACEUR, is that U.S. nuclear weapons were so important to the defense of Europe, and SACEUR was in command of that defense, and he had immediate access to U.S. nuclear weapons, and we had thousands of them in Europe and thousands more on call outside of Europe, right? And this captures the essence of what NATO is. It's a nuclear alliance with nuclear guarantees, right? And this is not the place to explore nuclear deterrence theology, but I think those who are in the trade know that what's called extended deterrence, which is providing a nuclear deterrent for another country, is a complicated and dangerous and costly business, right? And it's become much less complicated and much less costly after the Soviet Union collapsed. But if we're getting ready to have another Cold War, I can assure you it's about to get really complicated and really dangerous again. And I think that should cause you to reconsider what it is you're getting ready to do. Now, you asked us, there was a second question asked about leadership in Europe, military leadership in Europe after NATO, and I actually think that the U.S. is not going to be the military leader of Europe after NATO. The whole point of getting out is for the U.S. not to be assuming great military burdens in that part of the world, right? And part of the reason for that is that we simply have other things we have to do. But the other reasons for it is that our activities in Europe are not cost-free. It's not only it's not cost-free in dollar sense. People forget we fought 3 wars on the European periphery, basically around NATO and our commitment to NATO since the Cold War ended. We didn't have hot wars over NATO during the Cold War. We only had hot wars over NATO in the post-Cold War world. One in Bosnia, one in Kosovo, one in Libya, motivated in part by the particular interests of our allies. These were not great threats to the United States of America. So we are now fighting wars to protect NATO, not fighting wars to protect the United States, fighting wars to protect NATO. And it's natural this is going to occur because NATO has many frontiers. And there's always going to be problems on those frontiers. And someone is always going to argue we can solve that problem by moving the frontier a little farther in the other direction, right? So NATO is a permanent argument for some military action somewhere.
Tom, do you want to respond to anything?
Yeah, I might sort of take a slightly different angle because I think these security issues are really important, but I think it's also important to realize that the U.S. role in Europe is much broader than military issues. the United States has played a pretty leading role politically and diplomatically. And, I agree with Josh that I think I was very worried about Article 5. I think Trump did not want to reiterate it, but he did. And now I think some of that is fairly set in stone, at least for a while. But I am worried by the diplomatic and political disengagement from Europe. And I'll just give you one or two examples, I think, where it worked in the past and where it's not really working now. There was an occasion a few years ago when Greece was on the verge of being thrown out of the Eurozone in a showdown between Cyprus and the German finance minister, Wolfgang Schäuble. It was the US Treasury Secretary working with France and with Italy that largely kept Greece in because of the repercussions for the global economy. That was a good example of the US being very engaged. Is Treasury as engaged today? Toria and other of our colleagues in state were very involved in Eastern and Central Europe in helping to build democratic institutions and ensuring that that part of the world actually functioned very well and could stand on its own 2 feet. That's jeopardized today. The president went to Poland last summer and didn't say a word about protecting democratic institutions. So I do think that there are ways in which the US is not leading or taking a sort of a very assertive role in Europe, but playing sort of a helpful, constructive role, because Europe, I think, is in good shape, but it is also very challenged today because of all of these overlapping crises and tensions. They're manageable, but they have to be managed. I mean, if we don't do anything, then they will gather and become worse. And so I think there is a role to be played there.
I'd like to key off of that, and by the way, thank you, General, for your excellent question. Josh, can you tackle that question about whether there's some sort of a battle underway in Europe for core liberal democratic values? That there's actually an ideological struggle of sorts, that we're seeing creeping authoritarianism and populism. Vladimir Putin seems to be fanning those flames. So couldn't an American retreat from Europe amount to a retreat from that sort of fundamental clash of values and surrender that battlefield?
So I think we should be upfront and say we should be happy that Western values are more predominant in Europe than they were during the Cold War. I don't think anyone would disagree that it's good that broadly liberal societies with broadly capitalist systems are more prevalent upon the continent of Europe than they were in the last 100 some odd years. Having said that, let's note where the countries that are in liberal retreat are. They're Poland, they're Hungary, they're Czech Republic. They are the countries, and you all should pay attention to this, they are the countries that when NATO expanded, we were told bringing them into NATO would stop this from occurring. Now, some of us thought this was a bad idea. We were told that we were wrong, that this would spread liberal values. Now they're backsliding. Now, cueing to the traditional definition of insanity of doing the same thing over and over and expecting a different outcome, I kind of see this as a fool's errand. That I would say NATO is not required, the US presence is certainly not required to sustain the liberal values that have occurred. If they are to be sustained, they do require a greater sense of European identity, and the EU can play a lion's share of the role. Now, to General Breedlove's question about leadership, this is a natural segue, because I think the question of what the U.S. does, how the U.S. plays a leadership role if it's not to be in NATO, is indeed via the EU. We've not mentioned that for the last 25 years, if not longer, the United States has made European security and defense cooperation secondary to NATO, and indeed had enshrined that the European security initiatives will not replace NATO's military functions. A leadership role, therefore, would be walking that back and letting the Franco-German security relationship take the place.
Toria, let me put this one to you. There's a debate about whether or not a new Cold War is underway, and be interested in your opinion on that to the extent that the label is meaningful or not. But some people say there's not a global ideological struggle that where both sides are kind of trying to achieve world domination. On the other hand, it seems at least arguable to me that there is a kind of ideological fight insofar as the US and Western Europe and much of the rest of Europe represent, again, these sort of basic liberal democratic values, and they are in competition with a vision of kind of authoritarianism backed up by maybe kleptocracy, a sort of more amoral vision of governance. And in that sense, it is a truly ideological struggle. Do you think that's the right way to frame the question of what's happening in Europe? And do you think that the United States is essential to winning that kind of a fight?
I don't think it's only a problem in Europe. I think it's a global problem that authoritarianism is on the rise, and that authoritarians are feeling their oats, and that kleptocracy, as you said, state-sponsored corruption, rapacious state capture of economies is one of the key tools, and it disempowers individuals, and it's inherently unstable because these countries are dissatisfied powers and they want to continue to expand territorially. So we have a rising number of countries who are dissatisfied with the liberal world order that the United States and its European allies built, grew, sustained for all of this time. So that's why it's precisely not the moment to dismantle the key structures, security, political, economic, that sustain and advance the interests of the liberal team. And I actually worry, I think Josh is right, that the EU has far better tools than we do to address the rollback, or that NATO does in Poland and Czech Republic and Hungary. After all, they're giving them mass amounts of EU assistance and no longer demanding that they live up to the rule of law standards that they had to live up to get in. But there are plenty of other countries who are admiring the authoritarians and replicating their behavior. And by the way, when those countries see similar behavior now in the United States, when we are challenging from the executive branch checks and balances, when we are questioning our own independent judiciary, when we are attacking the media, when we are fanning intolerance in our own country, we are no longer that beacon of hope and prosperity and tolerance and values on the liberal team. And why shouldn't the autocrats take comfort and think, hey, they're not doing it, why should we?
Barry, does restraint amount to dimming the beacon and allowing the autocrats to operate in darkness and do them a favor?
No. Look, the panelists all seem to agree that there's been some kind of emergence of intense identity politics across the world since the Cold War ended. When we first fought the wars in the Balkans, we told ourselves this was a little localized incubus and that we, the good guys, were going to rub this out and prevent it from spreading. Well, I don't think it's an illness that spreads. I think something is going on across societies, developed and underdeveloped, that's causing identity politics. It's causing people to organize politics around race, around religion, around nation, around identity. And this was not supposed to happen. The US-led liberal world order was meant to prevent this, and it didn't, and it couldn't, because it seems to come from something else. Now, I don't exactly know what it is. I think you see this sort of thing happen when you get periods of very rapid social economic change, which is certainly what we've been seeing in the last 20 years. And it affects politics. It affects politics everywhere. But because it's affected politics here, it makes it particularly dissonant for us to talk about the U.S. being the bulwark of this in the world, right? It's just very, very odd. Now, the final thing I would say, I don't know that the authoritarians are collaborating to produce a world authoritarian nationalist order. I think if the Chinese and the Russians were left to their own devices for a short period of time there in Eurasia, they'd be at each other's throats. One of the things that keeps them together is us, right? That's the way balance of power works, right? We call it the US-led liberal international order for a region. We don't call it the consociational order, the collaborative order, right? The Council of Democracies. Inside Washington, we call it the US-led liberal international order. We're the revolutionary state. We're the revolutionary state. Whether the authoritarians will coalesce to oppose us as the world revolutionary state, who knows, right? But they certainly make alliances.
Tom, what about populism? We've been focusing primarily on authoritarianism in the last couple of minutes, and several of you have touched on populism. But does an American retreat do the populists a favor? Or sometimes the populists in Europe use the United States as a foil to useful effect?
It depends. I think most of the populist parties in Europe are generally anti-American and pro-Russian. You know, UKIP, Farage, pro-Russian, Front National in France, pro-Russian AFD. So I don't think they would be particularly sorry if the United States left Europe. I think they'd be pretty happy about that. I think one point I would like to make too about the EU is that, you know, my reading of it is Putin sees the EU as much more of a threat than NATO. He's not so much worried about troops on the border. I mean, what troops are going to invade Russia? What countries are going to invade Russia? What he's worried about is, and the reason why he acted in Ukraine, which is the association agreement with the EU, was about the spread of liberal market economies and democracies up to his border that would be successful and that would be emulated by Russians who would want a different future for their country. I don't think he was necessarily wrong about that, right, from his point of view. I of course, think that that's a price we're paying, because I think if Poland or other countries want to be democratic, we should help them to do so. But I think he fears, and the Chinese in a different way, fear the liberal order, not because of security decisions that are taken, but because they believe that its very existence ultimately pose a threat not to their countries, but to their regimes. They believe that a liberal international order is not safe for authoritarianism, which is why their strategy at the moment is to weaken it, and the way they're weakening it is to weaken the key members of it, their will to actually uphold it. And so that's the contest that I think is ongoing. They have a reason to do it. I don't think we should think that it's irrational. It may even be reasonable from their point of view, but that I think is a challenge.
Josh, if you could wave your magic wand and change the trajectory of American foreign policy, what does Eastern Europe look like in a decade? Ukraine, Poland, the Baltic states?
You know, that's the first time I've ever thought about that question, which says a lot on me as a
Well, let me frame it this way.
thinker.
Are you throwing them to the
Sure,
wolves the way Tom would
So,
suggest?
I suppose I would give two different answers. One, I could imagine a European, you know, this Franco, if Russia really proves to be a security threat to the continent of Europe, that is, Russian capabilities continue to grow, the ideological campaign that seems to be sort of kind of underway accelerates, I can imagine one of two scenarios in my magic, magical universe. One would be a regional confederation of the threatened East European states banding together to oppose Russia. We've seen this before. It actually hasn't gone poorly, although at least and we can speak to this a little bit more later on if anyone's interested. And I'll just note that again, that the East European countries alone, the Baltic states, Poland, Hungary, Czech Republic alone, have a GDP that is almost exactly Russia's GDP and probably have a healthier base on which to grow in the future. That would be one scenario. The second scenario would be, well, maybe Russia turned out to be a really big threat and that nascent or something that we could tell ourselves a story of, something that looks like a European traditional security threat begins to emerge, then I would call for the EU to step up in that scenario. And to Tom's point about the EU mainly being a liberal order building force, liberal values building force, that would be the scenario where European values building force becomes a European security-led force. But I come back to it, under that scenario, the US is still not the primary security provider.
Great. Okay, we're just down to a handful more questions before we have the brief closing statement, so we're in the sort of home stretch here. Toria, question for you. Actually, on the flight down today, I ran into, by happenstance, a senior member of Congress who communicates regularly with the White House, who is interested in the fate of the Iran nuclear deal, and is actually pretty pessimistic that when President Trump revisits the nuclear deal again in, I believe it's May, that he will once again sort of renew America's commitment to the agreement, and stress the importance of negotiations that are going on right now between Washington and European capitals, because of course, as we know, several European countries were parties to the nuclear deal. What would the effect be of President Trump essentially abandoning the nuclear deal on transatlantic relations? And could that be a real turning point where we see the breach widen in a way that we haven't so far? What would the implications of that be, given that the Europeans very strongly support the deal and are urging President Trump not to walk away from it?
I worry about the impact more on the United States than on the transatlantic relationship. The Iran nuclear deal is far from perfect. I'll be the first one to say that, but it does have the Iranian nuclear problem contained and somewhat rolled back. What we have not done as a community of nations is deal with the Iran missile problem, the Iran terrorism problem, the Iran territorial acquisitions, whether they are in Syria or Yemen or elsewhere. And what we ought to be doing with U.S. leadership and with our European and global partners is pocketing the Iran nuclear deal, extend it if we can when the time comes, but address the things that it didn't address and address them aggressively together.
Barry, on that note, but without, I don't want to go deeply into the Iran nuclear issue specifically, but on the question of American-European security partnership generally, which will be the focus of next couple of questions, how important is that? I mean, how vital are the Europeans to Washington's ability to have an effective foreign policy beyond Europe in places like the Middle East? Isn't that a crucial component of the transatlantic relationship?
Well, it's difficult to unravel all this because, again, I'm in the position of having to argue for policies that I actually don't have less concern about than other people do, right? So it's, I mean, it's just.
What would your reaction be? Not on the.
Let me approach it. Let me approach it a different way. Look, restraint is not an isolationist foreign policy. Restraint is not a foreign policy that eschews cooperation with other great powers, right? That's not what it is, right? So if there are parts of the world where the Europeans, the Americans, and the Russians have common interests, then they should cooperate to pursue those interests, right? Most of the pressure that we're putting on Iran, right, to get them to accept the JCPOA is economic pressure, right? And our partners, not just those in NATO, but the Russians were very, cooperative and very instrumental. So I don't rule out cooperation with other centers of power. And my own view is that in the long term, a Europe that is looking after itself more vigilantly is a Europe that's a better partner for the United States because it's a more capable partner, it's a more cohesive partner. Now, many people would say this is a pipe dream, that if we leave, the Europeans are just going to split apart like billiard balls hitting the break, right? And Tom would say, well, you can't guarantee that they won't. And the answer is no, I cannot guarantee that they won't, right? Nobody can guarantee that they won't, right? But given international politics as I understand it, I think the other result is much more likely. And I think in the long term, because the world is turning into a world of big powers, China is a big power, right? India ultimately will probably be a big power, right? The world is going to be managed by a coalition of big powers. The Europeans can be one of those big powers if they want to be it. And if they can, then we will often find ourselves cooperating with them.
Tom, what do you think the implications would be for the U.S.-European relationship if Trump were to abandon the nuclear deal? We've already seen the reaction in Europe to his withdrawal from the Paris Climate Accords, which is still something that European leaders raise all the time when they're in Washington. Would this kind of be a qualitative worsening of the relationship if he were to go his own way, reject the pleas of the French, the Germans, the British, the EU?
Yeah, this is their top priority, I think. I think they're much more worried about this than they are about Paris for many reasons. I mean, they care about Paris, but I think they care more about this. It's interesting that the British Foreign Secretary, Boris Johnson, came to Washington a couple of months ago when President Trump and Rex Tillerson and Mattis were all in Asia or out of the country, and he came precisely because they weren't there, which is amazing, and he came to try to lobby on the Hill on the Iran deal, right, to try to build support. So that's, I think, a measure of how seriously they take it. It's very unclear what Trump will do if he pulls out. It's quite possible that he will formally pull out of the deal, but nothing really will happen, and the deal will actually continue just with the United States on the outside, which is an incredible indictment actually of his ineffectiveness. You know, if an American president pulls the plug on a deal, something should happen. Even if you like that deal, you might think that, you know, it's sort of it's a sign of impotence of sorts that it just
Unless the whole
continues.
thing's a show.
The alternative is that actually he does collapse it, that there are costs imposed, and then he has a decision to make, because Europe will not come on board for multilateral sanctions if they blame the president for having wrecked the deal. And so then he has a choice about whether to use force or not against Iran. And my sense is that he hasn't thought any of this through. He's basically making this decision because somebody's putting a piece of paper in front of him every few months saying you have to recertify, and he hates having to sign the piece of paper, and so he says, I'm not going to do this again. There's a precedent on other issues as well. It gets into his information stream, right? It gets his attention. And it's a farcical situation, but some people seriously suggested just suspending the requirement for recertification, because then he wouldn't notice and it would just continue. And so he hasn't thought through the next steps. The Europeans, I think, are hopeful that it will be preserved, but they are very worried about the upcoming deadline.
Thanks. Josh, let me ask you one question before we go to closing statements. And I guess it's to get a sense of your analysis of what's possible in U.S.-Russian relations at this point. I mean, what you see in at least English language Russian media that I'm able to read, you know, there's this regular refrain that basically Russia would like to have normalized relations with the United States. It's simply not possible. Even if the United States elects a president who says that he wants to be friends with Russia, the sort of blob in Washington pins him down, tells him he can't do it, and it's more or less hopeless unless you have real structural change in Washington, because the machine prevents someone like Donald Trump from cutting deals with Vladimir Putin. Do you think that's right? Or do you think there is some way in the world we live in now, in the next couple of years, that there could be some accommodation, some thaw in U.S.-Russian relations that the sort of foreign policy establishment can swallow?
So I think there is progress to be made in the U.S.-Russian relationship. I should be clear, I don't read Russian, I don't speak Russian, I'm not a Russia scholar, so this is me reading as much as you are. So let me preface my remarks with that. Having said that, Russia is an awfully, it's a reasonably big country with a lot of nuclear weapons, and it's in touching a lot of parts of the world where the U.S. seems to care about. So given all that, it's very plausible that the U.S. and the Russians will find their interests consistent or constant enough that the U.S. policy establishment will wake up, realize that, you know what, antagonizing Russia over and over again at a time when nuclear issues are back on the agenda, when we have issues with China, when there are concerns over common fights against fundamentalist Islam, fundamentalist Islamic terrorism, to be more precise, are all concerns that the U.S. and Russia may find a common source of refrain. Part of this will also hinge, however, on U.S. decisions. Emphasis is on the United States' decision when it comes to the future of Ukraine and other engagement in Eastern Europe. I think, all things being equal, the U.S. has a better chance of finding an accommodation with Russia on issues of common interest, the less the U.S. does in and around Eastern Europe. But that's my hypothesis. I understand that people have disagreements about this.
Great. Well, thanks, everybody, for fielding these questions. And we're now going to move to closing statements. You all have a tidy 1 minute to sum up the future, past and present of transatlantic relations. And Tom, I'll put you in the hot seat and start with you, and we'll go from left to right as I see it.
Thank you, Michael. Rather than summarize what I said, I'll just say one of the things I'm reflecting on at the moment is the entire assumption of this debate has been that Europeans are basically taking advantage of the United States, or the US is providing security. And if you looked at it from the other point of view, many European countries would say that they all fought with the United States in Afghanistan. Over half of them fought with the United States in Iraq in a war they didn't agree with because the President of the United States asked them to. They would say that's part of burden sharing. They sign on to tough sanctions on Iran, and they are a partner in managing the international financial crisis that they believe started here. And so I would say that this relationship has been remarkably successful at a very low cost, and it benefits both parties. And now, I don't think any time is the time for the sort of radical solutions like ending NATO, but I think now when Europe is again challenged by problems that are manageable, that this is precisely the wrong time to really divert course in what has been a successful approach.
Great, thank you, Tom. Barry?
Well, I think the United States is entering a new period in international politics. There are powers out there that are as rich as we are. We've never faced such powers. It's going to be tough to compete with those powers. China's going to be a tough competitor. It already is. Russia's made itself a tough little competitor. The United States just simply has to play a tighter game. In the post-Cold War world, the United States has been at war twice as often as it was during the Cold War, twice as often. We were at war almost all the time. There are little wars, controllable wars, sometimes expensive and nasty wars, right? But at war a lot, right? So the United States needs to pull in its horns. It has to find ways to set priorities. It has to find ways to get others to pay the costs of managing global security, right? Now, the place in the world, ironically, where the Americans have been most successful, where there are democratic countries, wealthy countries, cooperation institutions, not much threat, is Europe. So it's time to turn the Europeans into a real set of allies and not the security dependencies that they have been.
Thank you. Toria?
I can't say it better than Tom said it. For those of us who agree that it ain't fundamentally broke and it ain't making us broke, so we should not do radical surgery to it. If we want more global security, we cannot do it all by ourselves. We have helped create, the Europeans obviously did it themselves, a stronger, more capable, more secure Europe that can play a larger role, that is playing a larger role. The answer is not to leave them and hope that they continue to do it. The answer is to double up and do more of it together, and particularly outside of Europe where we haven't gotten it right, like in the Middle East. I was particularly struck by what Tom said about the nuclear deal potentially going on without us, as Paris has gone on without us, and as the Trans-Pacific trade deal is going on without us. So our danger is not that we make America great again, but that we make America irrelevant again if we're not careful and if we give up on our historic friendships and allies.
Josh?
Well, so Tom made a good comment earlier that I want to echo. He made the point, I wrote it down, that sports teams don't stop training after they win a championship. That's 100% true, but they often enter rebuilding years. And maybe that's my Aggie inclination, I don't know. And so at a time when the U.S. is under duress in multiple different directions, when the U.S. mission, and we've all echoed this, has been very successful in Europe, it's time for the U.S. to put its resources on other issues. Now, Victoria made the comment that we only spend something like 1%, I know you didn't say 1%, but 3% cumulative of our GDP, not all of it's going to Europe. That's fine. Let's imagine it's only 1% of GDP allocated to Europe. That's more than $100 billion a year. I can think of lots of things that the U.S. could spend $100 billion a year on in other parts of the world, in the United States at home. A lot of different options. And my simple point would be, at a time when the U.S. mission in Europe is successful, why would we not avail ourselves of the opportunity to take advantage of our victory in Europe and figure out the issues that really matter going forward?
Great. Thank you, Josh, Toria, Barry, Tom. Thank you all for joining us this evening, and we hope you enjoyed the debate, which is now concluded. Please continue to follow this Brookings Charles Koch series throughout 2018, and we welcome your feedback on Twitter on how tonight went using the hashtag #AmericaInTheWorld. From Atlanta, thank you and good night.
Thank you, Atlanta.